Hello, welcome back. We're going to continue today with our first unit. Just as a quick recap, this course is divided into two units, one on the philosophy of love, one on the philosophy of sex. And last time around, we did the introduction to the first unit, which is on the philosophy of love. We talked about what philosophy is, what the philosophy of love in particular is, right? The questions that it asks. Um, and we looked at the history of Western philosophy as well as some of the main concepts that that have been useful, that have been used in the history of Western philosophy to distinguish between kinds of love and to talk about what love is, right? The concept of eros, the concept of philia, and the concept of agape. Now, if you look at the structure of that first unit on the course outline, the unit on the philosophy of love, you'll see that it's divided into four topics. The first one is love as union. The second one, love as valuation. The third one, love as motivated concern. We'll see what that means. And the fourth one, love as unmotivated concern. Now, these are all different theories about what love consists in. Okay, what it is to be in love, what the experience of love involves. So today we're starting on the first of those topics, love as union. Okay, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Um, the theory or the thesis that love is union, so either that it is a union between the lover and the beloved, a kind of union between the lover and the beloved, or at least that love is a desire for union on the part of the lover with the beloved, right? The lover's desire for union with the beloved has been a mainstay of the philosophy of love, well, for about as long as there has been philosophy of love. Okay, so it is one of the big theories that contemporary philosophers writing about love now continue to defend. And I'll point out right now, one of the main defenders in contemporary philosophy, one of the main defenders of this thesis or this theory of love as a kind of union is Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name actually, who is is a very important philosopher of the 20th century and who has a famous paper called um, Love's Bond, Love's Bond, where he discusses this kind of a view. So it's a thesis that is still important in the philosophy of love, but what we're going to do, because as I've mentioned a few times, this is a history of philosophy class, is read one of the most important ancient texts about this. Okay, so for these next two lectures, where we're talking about love as union, and for the two lectures after that, where we're going to be talking about love as valuation, we're going to be reading Plato's Symposium. We're going to be reading excerpts from Plato's Symposium. And the reason that we're using the same text is that Plato's Symposium, as we'll see, is a dialogue containing several different characters who present views. And one of the characters, Aristophanes, presents this kind of view that love is a kind of union. Okay, and so for these first two lectures, we're going to be interested in Aristophanes, in Aristophanes' speech in the Symposium. And then for the next two lectures, we're going to be interested in Socrates' speech in the Symposium because he defends a view that love, or that a more important aspect of love, is valuation. Okay. Anyway, we'll get there when we get there. But here is a quick overview of what I want to do with you today. I said that we're talking about Aristophanes' speech, which is true, but also Aristophanes' speech is very, very short. Actually, the entire symposium is pretty short as a work of philosophy, but Aristophanes' speech in particular is quite short. And so I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I've got two lectures on it to dump a whole bunch of background on you, okay? A whole bunch of background both about the historical context and about the broader dialogue that is the symposium, because I didn't get you to read all of it. And so I'm going to supplement it by telling you about it here in this lecture. Okay, so first, I'm going to tell you about the ancient Greek context, because I just cannot drop you into the symposium, a work of ancient Greek philosophy, without any background, because you will just be confused. So I'll tell you about ancient Greek polytheism, okay, their religious beliefs. I'll tell you about the status of women in ancient Greece, because there are several things that are said in the symposium that if you don't know about this, you might think, what? I don't understand. And same thing with the institution of pederasty in ancient Greece. I'm sure there are several things that were said in the symposium that struck you as very odd, and they will be better understood against the background of the institution of pederasty in ancient Greece. So I'm going to spend some time telling you about this context so that you know what's happening in this dialogue, and then we'll move on to the dialogue itself, to the symposium. So I'll give you a bit of background. First off, about the author, Plato, and second off, about the structure of the dialogue. And as part of that, I'll tell you about the first three speeches. Okay, the symposium, as I said, is a series of characters making speeches about something, and you'll see it's about love. And before we get to Aristophanes' speech, which is the fourth speech, there are three speeches. Okay, and since I didn't get you to read them, I'm going to go over them with you now. So really, we're barely going to talk about Aristophanes' speech today. The main thing we're going to do is get some historical background and get some details about the symposium and what happens leading up to Aristophanes' speech, so that we can then talk about Aristophanes' speech, because that's where we get this classic statement of the thesis that love is a kind of union between the lover and the beloved. Okay, so let's talk about, like I said, the ancient Greek context. That's what we're going to spend about, a third to half of the lecture on. Here is my handy timeline with my little "You Are Here" pin, to inform you about where we are on this timeline of history, on this timeline of Western history that I showed you last lecture. Okay, I'll always do this when we begin talking about a new source, just so you know where we are in this historical narrative. Okay, so we're here. Plato wrote between 300 and 400 BC, so about 2,400 years ago. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the historical context in which he wrote. That is, the historical context of ancient Greece, but more specifically of ancient Athens. Okay, Greece was a collection of city-states, each one of which was independent from each other, that could go to war against each other and so on. And so they were kind of each mini countries. And so they didn't all have the same cultures, they didn't have the same customs, they didn't have the same institutions. And so what I'm going to be telling you about in particular is not just ancient Greece in general, but ancient Athens. Okay. So the first thing to note about ancient Greece, and this does apply to ancient Greece in general, not just Athens, is that they were polytheists. Okay. If you look at the word there, polytheism, the word poly there, of course, means, many, several, like somebody who is polyamorous, has several lovers. Theism there just refers to belief in God, right? A theist is somebody who believes in God. So polytheist, or a polytheistic religion, is just a religion that has many different gods. And the ancient Greek religion was a polytheistic religion. They had a pantheon, so like a collection, if you will, of gods that featured 12 major gods. These you might have heard of, gods like Zeus, the god of thunder, and Hera and Poseidon, the god of the sea, as well as hundreds of minor gods. Okay, so they believed in a whole bunch of different gods. And one thing that's worth pointing out, that will come back on the next slide, is that each one of these gods corresponded to a god in the Roman religion. Okay, so for every one of the Greek gods, there was an analog in the Roman religion. So, for example, Zeus in the Greek pantheon was thought to be the same god as Jupiter in the Roman pantheon. Poseidon in the Greek pantheon was thought to be the same god as Neptune in the Roman pantheon, and so on and so forth. So for each one, you had an analog in the Roman religion. And each one of these gods was thought to be in charge of a particular area of life. Okay, so like I just said, Zeus was thought to be the god of thunder. Poseidon was thought to be the god of the sea. Hera was the god, among other things, or the goddess, I should say, among other things, of women. Okay, so and with hundreds of gods, you had, all the different areas of life presided over by different gods. And one such god, and this is going to be crucial for reasons I'll explain, was Eros. Eros with a capital E, the god of love. Okay, Eros with a capital E is a proper name, a proper noun, and it is the name of the god. But Eros with a capital E is in charge of romantic love. Eros with a lowercase e. right? The what he's in charge of is romantic love, so eros with a lowercase e. And so when you're reading the symposium, you'll notice sometimes love is capitalized and sometimes love has a lowercase l. Well, what they're tracking there is the difference between love, meaning eros with a capital E, the name of the god, and then love with a lowercase l or eros with a lowercase e, which is the name of romantic love, right? Or which refers to romantic love. So that's why you see that. Okay. So the idea was each one of these gods is in charge of something. Eros is in charge of the god is in charge of love. Um, and one thing to note about Eros is he is the equivalent to the Roman god Cupid. Okay. So Eros, like we're used to this image of Cupid with a bow and arrow, right? And Cupid shoots you with his arrow, and you fall in love with the person whom you see. Right? That's how we picture Cupid. Well, that actually comes down to us all the way back from ancient Greece. Okay? Eros, the god Eros, was also depicted. This is a statue of him, by the way. Was depicted usually with a bow and arrow. And there was this image of him. When you fall in love, what has happened is that Eros has struck you with his arrow, with the arrow of love, and has caused you to fall in love. Okay? Um, so that's the image that we're working with in this dialogue is this image of Eros, the god of love, creating in someone this experience of love by shooting them with his arrow, right? So the idea is gods are in charge of different things, they're doing different things. And so when you explain some phenomenon in the world, you explain it in terms of the god that is causing it, right? There's a storm. Why? Well, Zeus must be angry. Um, something terrible has happened to our women. Why? Well, something must be going on with Hera, right? The sea is particularly still. Well, Poseidon must be at peace. Something like this. Okay, so you explain the natural phenomena, the things happening in the natural world or in the social world, in terms of the gods that are in charge of them. Similarly, you explain love, erotic love, eros, in terms of the god Eros. Okay, so that's going to be very important while reading the symposium. They go back and forth between talking about love with a capital L, which is the god, Eros with a capital E, and love with a lowercase l, which is the phenomenon of love, right, with a lowercase l. Um, and the reason for that is that by talking about love, you're talking about what the god does. And when you talk about the god, you're talking about the love that he produces, right, or the love that he creates or instills in someone. Okay. So one thing that's relevant, another thing that's relevant about how love was conceived, erotic love or erosic love, eros, was conceived in ancient Greece is that it was described as a theomania. Okay, thea again is that word there, like theism that comes from the Greek theos, meaning God. Right? Mania, well, you probably recognize it means craziness, right? Madness, I should say. A theomania is a madness that comes from the gods. Okay. There are other examples of things that they thought of as theomanias, madnesses that come from the god, like poetic inspiration, right? When you're inspired and you create a great work of art or something like this, it's the gods inspiring in you a certain artistic vision or something like this. But they thought about love, romantic love or erotic love, as a theomania. So the idea, I mean, we have this image too, right? The idea is that when you are hit with Cupid or Eros's arrow, you suddenly are overcome by this uncontrollable longing or desire for another person. And it's a madness, right? You can't think straight, you can't eat, you can't sleep. If you've ever had the experience of falling in love, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, maybe that's for the best. There are some ways in which it's quite difficult because again, can't think straight, can't eat, can't sleep. You're just sitting there wondering what your beloved is doing, whether they're going to call, and so on and so forth. But that's the sense in which they're thinking of it as a madness, right? It's something that happens and that comes from the gods because it comes from Eros, right? This falling in love comes from eros, this kind of head over heels experience. Now, another thing that I want to point out here with this idea of the god Eros inspiring love in you by shooting you with his arrow is that there was a certain ambivalence about it in ancient Greek culture, right? To be ambivalent is to not have a decisive opinion, like you're kind of on the fence about it. So while, of course, falling in love was seen by some people as a good, it was seen by other people as something that's a bit of a nuisance. And actually, really, you see this kind of attitude toward love for a big chunk of Western history, like in the medieval period, for example. And anyway, because of course, love is a bit of a nuisance, especially when uh, you fall in love with somebody who isn't, say, the wife that you were set up with, right? Because there were a lot of arranged marriages. That can be very socially disruptive. Or when you fall in love with, or if you're not even married yet, and you fall in love with somebody else than the wife you're supposed to be marrying, for example. Or if you're already married and you fall in love with somebody else's husband, or, it can be a disruptive kind of force. And if you've got other things to do, whether it's homework or training or whatever, love can be a distraction, right? So there's an ambivalent attitude about whether love is a good thing or whether it's a bad thing. And this is going to come up in the dialogue. Okay. All right. That's what I want to tell you about Greek polytheism. That's going to help you contextualize what's going on. By talking about love, they're talking about the god, Eros. And by talking about the god Eros, they're talking about love, right? And they're going to be discussing, whether this theomania, this madness that comes from the gods, is good or bad, or if it can be either. Well, under what circumstances is it good, and under what circumstances is it bad? Okay. Um, Now, the next bit of historical context I want to give you is about the role of women in ancient Greece. Okay. What I've got here on the slide is a picture of an ancient Greek household from a textbook. And you can see up at the top right corner, there's a room labeled the Gynoeceum. Okay. The Gynoeceum was the area of the house reserved for women. Ancient Greek society was very, very patriarchal. What that means is men held all the power. Okay. Women had a subordinate role. Women were excluded from public life. So it was expected that men would participate in public life. Okay. So they would have some kind of work, that they would participate in politics by voting, by discussing these kinds of things. But women were excluded from these kinds of things. Men also tended to exercise, things like this in a public location, whereas women did not. And women were relegated to the Gynoeceum. That's where they stayed. And they were involved, or they were occupied with household chores, okay, cleaning the laundry, tending to the kids, making the food, that kind of thing. So it's a very patriarchal society where there's sex seclusion. Right? It's sex secluded, meaning there's a division between the areas where the men are and the areas where the women are. And this is related to the fact that in ancient Greek society, women were typically regarded as both physically and mentally inferior to men. Okay. They tended to think that women were less intelligent, but also, and you found this in various areas of Greek life, that they were physically inferior. So not just less strong, which on average is true, but also less beautiful. Okay. When you look at classical paintings from ancient Greece, the statues are largely of male bodies, right? So there was an idealization of the male form. Okay, so many people, and it's very hard to know how many, okay? We just don't have that much information. This might have been an attitude that was mostly to be found among like artists, for example, or among the aristocracy, right? The higher classes. It's just not clear. But what is clear is that many people regarded the male form as more beautiful than the female form. Probably in part because ancient Athens, like other ancient Greek societies, were warrior societies, right? They were constantly at war. men were expected to be well trained and this kind of thing. And so they came to see a kind of beauty in like the well trained male physique. Relatedly, right? This is going to clear up some stuff. Like there's points in the symposium where a character will say things. I don't think this occurs in anything that you've read yet, but a character will say something about how, well, obviously, males are more beautiful than females, or something like this. Well, this is why, okay? Um, again, it's not entirely clear how much of ancient Greek society thought this way. I've seen people claim that this is how everybody thought. There's just no evidence for this. Um, but it's clear that some people did. And it's clear that the characters whom Plato is depicting in the symposium think this. Okay. And what's related here is that there was a lot of homoeroticism, at least in some circles, again, within ancient Greek society. Homoeroticism is simply attraction between males. Okay. Um, now, in ancient Greece, it isn't as though everybody was homosexual or gay in our contemporary sense. Okay. When somebody's homosexual or gay in the contemporary sense of the term that we use it now, we usually think that this means that they're attracted only to males and that what they want is a relationship with an adult male to share their life with or something like this. That didn't, as far as we know, didn't really exist in ancient Greek society. The kind of homoerotic attractions that you see is between an older male and a younger male. And usually it's assumed that, like the older male here is already married to a woman usually, right? So it's assumed that you're attracted not just to males. And in fact, there was a social duty to be married and have offspring, right? It was expected of males, of men, that they get married and have children. But it was also quite common for these men who were married and also attracted to women, also to be attracted to other males, usually younger males. Okay. And so this kind of explains the vibe of the symposium. If you read the whole symposium, it's quite flirty. Okay. There's some of the characters here are younger males, like the first character to speak, Phaedrus, and other characters are quite flirty with him, for example. And this explains why. Okay, um, there's a sense that women are inferior, and to that degree, a sense that it's normal for men to be attracted to the superior beauty of other men, or at least of young men. Okay, so this explains some of what you see. Also, when characters distinguish between different kinds of love and which ones are better or worse, right? They're going to say things like, well, obviously, when it's directed at a male who is better, the love is better, right? It's got a better object, so of course it's got to be better. Whereas if the love is kind of common and not very good, it will be directed at both males and females, right? It's indiscriminate. Okay, so that's just to clear up why you'll see these kinds of claims if you read the symposium, especially if you read the symposium uh, in its entirety. Okay, and then the last bit of historical context that's necessary if you're going to understand what's going on in the symposium. This is maybe the most important one that I've already hinted at, but it's also maybe the most shocking one and weirdest one, is that there was in ancient Greece an institution of pederasty. Okay? Pederasty is simply an attraction to or relationship with a younger male. Okay, so there were relationships in ancient Greece between older males, adults, and younger males. The younger males would have been between around 12 and 14 or somewhere in there. Okay. Maybe a little bit further, actually, because it usually was expected that the younger male was too young to have a full beard. And once the younger male had a full beard, well, now he was an adult. He had entered into manhood, and it was, no longer appropriate for him to have an older male lover. Okay. So, in the way that this happened, the way that this occurred was that the older male was a mentor, right? His job was to kind of teach the younger male the ways of the world, teach him how to be, virtuous and a good warrior and all this kind of stuff. Um, and as a reward, he would get sexual favors from the younger male. I should just clear up right now, by the way. When I tell you these things, like I'm not endorsing, I'm just telling you how things work. Don't go tell your parents like, hey, my instructor says, relationships between older males and younger males are fine. I do not say that. I did not say that. I'm just telling you what happened in ancient Greece. Okay. And like what I said with uh, how common homoeroticism was. It's not entirely clear how common these kinds of relationships were. Okay. It seems like they were mostly contained to the aristocracy, okay, to the higher classes, like the ones, like the people who are featured in the dialogue. It is pretty clear that there were conflicting attitudes about it, right? In the dialogue itself, we hear that some people disapprove of these kinds of relationships. We hear that some fathers hire like bodyguards or chaperones to make sure that older men don't hit on their boys and stuff like this. So clearly, there's conflicting attitudes toward it. We don't know how common it was. Again, it's very easy to find on the internet. Please don't get your history on like TikTok or something like this, but it's very easy to find on TikTok like people claiming that in ancient Greece everybody was very accepting of same-sex relations, that it was like a much better time to be gay because there was no repression. That's just there's no basis for that. Uh, it seems like there were very conflicting attitudes about same-sex relations, first off. And second off, we really aren't talking about same-sex relations between adults. Like these were, as far as we can tell, more or less unheard of. Now it does seem to have been the case that usually an older male and a younger male, an older lover and a younger beloved, once the beloved reached adulthood, would sometimes remain good friends, but the romantic and sexual relationship, usually, from what we can tell, seems to have been restricted to when the boy was still quite young, okay, in his teens, basically. And so, this is not a model of healthy same-sex relations, I think. Not really what you want to be promoting. So yeah, uh, this seems to have been a relatively typical institution, and at least in certain sectors of society. And as we see in the dialogue, there seems to have been some pretty complex rules of etiquette around it. Okay, so uh, first, the lover was seen as the kind of active pursuant, whereas the beloved was the one being pursued. The beloved was the younger male, the lover was the older male. Um, and the beloved was supposed to resist for a bit, wasn't supposed to give in too easily. Like I said, often the father would appoint a guardian to make sure that nothing happened too early, or to make sure that nothing happened at all. So there was, this whole kind of intricate set of norms around the practice of pederasty, this practice of an older mentor taking on a younger protege, but also having a romantic and or sexual relationship with that protege. And the reason I bring it up is that this is the main kind of relationship that is discussed in the symposium. Okay. When the characters talk about love, when they talk about eros, when they talk about romantic love or desire or attraction, they are primarily talking about romantic love or desire or attraction, or sexual love or desire or attraction between an older male and a younger male. Okay. So if you don't know that, there's parts in the symposium, like in one of the first speeches, which I didn't get you to read, Phaedrus says, there's nothing that's better for a young boy than to have an older lover. You read this, you're like, what am I reading? This hopefully explains what you're reading. Okay, so that's the historical context. That's, I think, all the pieces you need to start to make sense of what is said in the symposium, and without which it might seem quite mysterious. Okay, let's move on now to the symposium as such. So if we're going to talk about the symposium, I should probably start by telling you a little bit about its author, Plato, because I don't really know how much you already know about him. So here is Plato on the right. This is a famous statue of him. As you might already know, Plato was one of the most important figures in Western philosophy. Along with Socrates and Aristotle, he's one of the most important ancient Greek philosophers. There's actually a relationship there between them. So we know that Plato was a student of Socrates, and we know that Aristotle studied at Plato's school, though we don't know whether they knew each other or how well they knew each other. Okay, but Plato founded a school called the Academy, or in ancient Greek, the Academia, which was the first institution of higher learning in Europe. And we know that Aristotle went to it. Okay. Um, Now, Plato was pretty atypical among philosophers because usually philosophers write treatises. Okay, what they write are book-length essays defending some thesis. Okay, but Plato didn't do that. Instead, Plato wrote dialogues. So basically, they're like little plays in which there are different characters that are discussing some topic, some idea, some question. Okay, um, and so when you read Plato, it's very different from reading an essay. You've got characters that are making different claims. Sometimes they make no arguments at all. Sometimes they make very bad arguments, and then sometimes they make quite good arguments and are debating with each other. Um, I told you in the last lecture that philosophy is all about uh, logical rigor and precision and clarity. And then the first thing we read is a dialogue um, in which not everybody's presenting very good arguments. In fact, in which not everybody's even presenting an argument at all. Sorry about that, but I promise the arguments are coming. Once we get to Socrates' speech, you'll see he'll say, well, what you guys are doing is just, poetic, it's rhetoric. I thought we were supposed to be giving reasons for why we believe things. And so he's going to start giving arguments about the nature of love. Okay. But anyway, as was implied by what I just said, and as is said on the slide here, Plato's dialogues usually feature Socrates as a character. It's important to understand here that what Plato is trying to do is not tell us about real conversations that the historical Socrates, the real guy, had. Um, we don't know what the real guy thought because Socrates never wrote anything. So the only way we know about Socrates is through the writings of other people, both people who intensely disliked him, like the poet Aristophanes, who also appears in this dialogue, um, or people who really liked him, like some of his students, including Plato himself. Okay, so everything we know about Socrates, we've gotten from other people. He never wrote anything. We don't even know if he knew how to write. This is just not something we know about him. But anyway, in Plato's dialogues, Socrates appears, but as a fictionalized version of himself. Um, and scholars think that many times, not always, but many times, when Socrates appears in Plato's dialogues, Plato is using him as a mouthpiece. Okay, so Socrates is expressing Plato's views, is what seems to be the case. And one of the reasons that we think that Plato is using Socrates as a mouthpiece is that oftentimes we find Socrates expressing views that we know were Plato's views. Okay, so Plato, for example, is most famous for developing what's sometimes called the theory of forms and sometimes called the theory of ideas. In a nutshell, Plato thought that physical reality was not ultimately real. Okay, he thought that it was kind of a pale reflection of the real world, which he thought was a world of ideas. This sounds very kooky, I'm sure, but I'll try to make it plausible when we get there. But as you'll see, when we get to Socrates' speech, when we get to the second excerpt, Socrates appeals to this view. He defends this view that there's a realm of intelligible forms or intelligible ideas, and that those are in some way more real than the physical objects of this world. Okay, so when you read Socrates, it seems that to some degree you're reading Plato's own views. Okay, now here's a little bit about the Symposium, this dialogue that we're reading excerpts from. This is the book, by the way. It's a delightful little read. It's very short. So I strongly recommend, if you've got the time, if you're interested in the history of philosophy or in the philosophy of love, that you take the time to read it in its entirety. It's easy to find, relatively cheap because it's tiny, and it is such an influential book. I mean, it's been influential to the entire philosophy of love, or at least within the West, since it was written 2,400 years ago. Like almost everybody who writes about love references this book. Um, the symposium occurs at a symposium, and a symposium is a drinking party. Okay, so the characters in the symposium are at a drinking party that's being held at the home of the playwright Agathon. And the reason is that Agathon has just won some prize for a play of his. Okay, so he's won some prize, and to celebrate, he's invited a bunch of people over to his house to have a drinking party. And in attendance are Agathon himself, of course, the host, Aristophanes, who's a poet and a playwright as well, Eryximachus, who's a doctor, Pausanias, who is a lawyer, and Phaedrus, who's just a young aristocrat, along, of course, with Socrates, who's going to give a long speech at the end defending his views about love. One thing that's worth noting here is that these are all real people. Okay. I already mentioned Socrates is a real guy, even though everything we know about him comes from other sources. Um, but he's not the only one. All of these are real people who existed in ancient Athens, right? There was a real playwright named Agathon, a real poet named Aristophanes, a real doctor named Eryximachus, a real lawyer named Pausanias, and there was a real young aristocrat whom Socrates seems to have known named Phaedrus. Okay. So you've got to understand, like these are real people, all of whom were part of the aristocracy in ancient Greece. So this is kind of like what Plato's doing here is kind of like if I were to write a play where I had my favorite philosophy professor, let's say at Gordon Davis at Carleton University, talking with um, the film director Denis Villeneuve and the son of Justin Trudeau and whatever, and putting words into their mouths. Okay, that's what Plato is doing here, and some of these people Plato likes, like Socrates. Some of these people Plato intensely dislikes, like Aristophanes. And of course, this is going to affect what he makes them say. Okay. So you'll see when you get to Aristophanes' speech, it is intentionally very stupid. Okay. I mean, I shouldn't say that because there is a beauty to Aristophanes' speech too. And there's a poetic way that he captures um, the human condition, maybe. There's something poetic to it and there's something beautiful to it. But at the same time, it's very awkwardly put together. Okay. Like the images are very silly. And I think that Plato is poking fun at how bad a poet he thinks Aristophanes is. Okay. If you read it with this in mind, it's quite amusing. Like he's parodying a real poet. And the reason that he doesn't like Aristophanes is that Aristophanes wrote a famous play called The Clouds, in which he parodies Socrates. Okay, so Aristophanes wrote this play where he depicts Socrates as this bumbling buffoon who has no idea what he's talking about and who's just bothering people with stupid questions all the time. And for this reason, Plato doesn't like him very much. Socrates, of course, was eventually killed by the Athenian people for asking too many questions. And so, it might be that Plato sees Aristophanes as, one of the people responsible for sullying his public image. I don't know. But anyway, clearly, Plato does not like Aristophanes very much. And what they're doing at the symposium, what all these people are doing at the symposium, is taking turns giving speeches about Eros, the god of love. Okay? They're going to take turns giving speeches in praise of the god Eros. But remember, in ancient Greek society, each god is in charge of a particular area of life. And the god Eros, who we know better as the Roman god Cupid, is in charge of romantic love. And so, by singing the praises of the god Eros, they're also going to be singing the praises of Eros with a lowercase e, of romantic love. Okay, so they're giving speeches in honor of the god Eros, or in your translation, the god love with a capital L. And in so doing, they're going to be discussing what his area, right, what the area that he's in charge of, romantic love, Eros with a lowercase e, is like. Right? They're going to be talking about what love is and what it's like. So you'll see that there are two kinds of questions being talked about in this dialogue. One, there are metaphysical questions. Okay, the characters are going to be talking about what love is and what it's like. The first couple speeches really only touch about on the ethical questions, but then people start to bring up metaphysical questions about what love is and what it's like, what eros, right, romantic love, um, is and what it's like. And then the other question that gets discussed, or the other kind of question, is ethical questions. They're going to be asking about what makes love good. Um, are there some kinds of love that are better than others? These are going to be the questions that they're looking at, and each is going to be giving different views. Now, it's worth noting, again, this is a drinking party. Um, and as the text progresses, you should keep in mind that the characters are drinking. The characters are getting drunker and drunker. So by the time you get to Aristophanes, 4 speeches in, this guy's pretty drunk as he's telling his very silly but also kind of tragic myth about the origins of love. Um, and characters are saying sillier things and stupider things until you get to Socrates. Socrates, at least according to Plato, was able to drink very heavily and never get drunk. And so once you get to him, you now get a sober view, um, and now you start to get what Plato thinks are good arguments about the nature of love. Okay, so that's what's going on in this dialogue. They're at a drinking party. They're going to make speeches in the honor of love, and in so doing, talk about romantic love or eros. Okay, so what I want to do now for the rest of the time we have is give you a summary of the 3 early speeches that I didn't get you to read, because it'll help to contextualize what comes next. It's worth noting that each of the speeches builds on the previous ones. Okay, so there's the first speech, the second one builds a bit on the first speech, the third one builds a bit on the second and the third, and so on and so forth, until you get to Socrates's, which is supposed to, I guess, try to bring it all together into a more unified, a more coherent theory of what love is and what it's like and why it's good. Okay, what it's good for and why, I should say. Okay, so now we're going to go through the first 3 speeches. I'll just give you, again, I do recommend that you go and read them for yourself. All of them are quite short. It's a delightful book, but I'm not making you read them. It's up to you. The only ones you have to read are Aristophanes is for this lecture and the next, and then Socrates is for the 2 after that. So I'll go through the first 3 speeches, which are the speeches that come before Aristophanes's. Then I'll just introduce Aristophanes' speech, and I'll leave the rest of it for the next lecture. And again, Aristophanes' speech is the one where we find this theory of love as union. Okay, so that's where we'll start talking about this theory that love is kind of union or a desire for union with the beloved. Okay, so the first 3 speeches. The first speech is by Phaedrus, who's the young aristocrat. The first thing I want to note here is that in the Symposium, and actually in just about every work of Plato's, you find this very sharp distinction between 2 things. On the one hand, rhetoric, and on the other hand, philosophy. Okay, so rhetoric is simply speech aimed at persuading. A speech that is often very beautiful or very inspiring, and that is aimed at persuading you, but not necessarily for good reasons. Okay, it's not trying to reason with you; it's just trying to motivate you, I guess, right? To get the right feelings going, so that you'll be persuaded or driven to action or whatever. Plato often contrasts that rhetoric with philosophy. Philosophy being, again, this way of supporting claims by good reasons, right? Of making arguments clear, getting clear about what the relationship between different claims is, and seeing whether the reasoning is any good. Okay, philosophy, unlike rhetoric, is unemotional. We're trying to get at a common understanding of what's true. And so you find this contrast all over the place in Plato, and you find it here in the Symposium. And one thing that stands out about Phaedrus' speech is that it's full of rhetoric. Okay, Phaedrus uses a bunch of very flowery language, and he makes all these kinds of poetic claims, but ultimately there's not very much to what he's saying. That said, there are some points that are going to be important in what he says. There are some points that are going to be important for the rest of the dialogue. And the main point he makes is that Eros is good because it inspires virtue. Okay. He starts his speech with this claim that there is this claim that I quoted earlier, that there is no greater good for a boy than to have a lover. And so again, he's talking about these pederastic relationships in ancient Greece, and he's saying there is nothing that is better for a young boy than for an older man who feels romantic or sexual attraction to him to take him under his wing. Okay. Why? Well, because that is the best way to produce virtue in, it seems he thinks, both of them. That's the best way to produce virtue both in the young boy who is being taught the ways of the world and in the older male. So here we've got a thesis. This is primarily an ethical thesis, right? Phaedrus is saying that love is good, and he's saying that the reason it's good is that it produces virtue, right? He's both got a claim about whether love is good. It is, he says, and about why. Well, it's because it inspires virtue, which presumably is itself good. Okay. But now let's look at his reasons for thinking this. He says that the reason that Eros is so good at inspiring virtue, right? That romantic or sexual attraction is so good at inspiring virtue is that there's nothing that produces as much shame and there's nothing that motivates as much to honorable action. What does he mean by that? Well, I assume that many of you, maybe most of you, have at some point had a crush on someone or even fallen in love with someone. Now, imagine, put yourself back in that mindset. Imagine if while you had a crush on someone or while you were madly in love with someone, they caught you doing something embarrassing. Imagine that they caught you or they saw you being very cowardly, or they saw you being very miserly, like ungenerous, or they saw you being just very selfish or something like this. Wouldn't that make you feel very shameful, right? That kind of burning feeling of all your blood going into your feet, that you feel so ashamed of yourself. Well, what Phaedrus is saying is that nothing produces as much shame as being caught. Right? Being caught doing something bad produces shame. But under no circumstances will it produce as much shame as if you're in love and caught by your lover or beloved. Okay. So for this reason, he thinks the love, the eros, the romantic attraction or desire, will prevent both the beloved and the lover from doing shameful things, because they wouldn't want their beloved or their lover to know that they've done something shameful, right? So it will put them on their best behavior. Moreover, nothing, he says, can motivate honorable action as much as being in love. So again, put yourself in this mindset. Imagine that you've got this crush on someone or you're madly in love with them, and an occasion presents itself for showing how courageous you are or how intelligent you are. Aren't you going to take that opportunity to show your beloved or show your lover how courageous or how intelligent you are? Of course you are, right? Of course you want to impress them. And so, Phaedrus says, again, not only will it put you on your best behavior in the sense of preventing you from doing things that are bad, but it will motivate you to do good, right? It will motivate you to be your best self, put it that way. Again, there are all kinds of other things and relationships that might motivate you to be honorable, to act honorably. But Phaedrus thinks nothing will do this quite as well as a romantic relationship. And so, for this reason, he thinks love is very good. Right? It brings out the best in both people involved. It prevents them from doing bad things and encourages them from doing encourages them to do good things. And then he makes this outrageous claim. This is where Phaedrus becomes a hippie, and he's like, everybody should just love each other, man, like that kind of claim. He says, if our entire army or even our entire society was made entirely of lovers, right, entirely of lover-beloved pairs, of older men and younger men, that would be the best possible army and the best possible society. Why? Well, because those would be the most virtuous possible citizens, he thinks, right? It's warriors, the warriors in that society would fight the hardest to impress each other in battle. They would fight hardest to protect each other as well because they care for each other as lovers. And so this is his somewhat over the top, right? We're supposed to think this is very silly um, claim that not only is love very good because it inspires virtue, but for that reason, our entire society should be a society of lovers. That would be the best possible society. Okay, so that's the main thing I want you to take away from Phaedrus' speech that you're going to need to know is that now that there's this discussion of first off, the goodness of love, why it's good, and second, this claim that the reason it's good is that it inspires virtue. Okay, and the people who are making the next speeches are going to have something to say about this. But now notice, even if this is true, right? And I think there is truth to this, right? There is truth to the fact that being in love or having loving relationships inspires you to good action and prevents you from bad action. That's probably true. But Phaedrus is not making any distinctions here between different kinds of love or different kinds of loving relationships. Will all loving relationships inspire virtue in this way? This is what some of the next speeches are going to talk about. Okay, so now let's move on to the second speech, which is Pausanias's speech. By the way, I don't expect you to remember, each point made by each person, except in Aristophanes' speech and Socrates' speech. What I do expect you to remember is which questions are being raised and which claims are being made. Okay, so I expect you to know that there's a discussion happening about whether love is good and a claim made that love is good because it inspires to virtue. You need to know that, but you don't need to know that Phaedrus is the guy who said it. Okay, so here's Pausanias' speech. And Pausanias puts his finger on exactly this point, that Phaedrus hasn't distinguished between different kinds of love. And he's going to want to make that distinction. Okay, now in the context of the dialogue, there's all these claims about the gods. He says, look, there's got to be two different kinds of Eros because we know that there's two different goddesses who are named Aphrodite, and we know that Eros is in love with Aphrodite, so there must be two gods that are called Eros. Forget about that. We don't have to talk about that. The main point is simply that Pausanias wants to say that there are two different kinds of Eros, two different kinds of romantic love or attraction or desire. One of them is what he calls common Eros, and its main characteristic is that it's directed primarily at the body of the beloved. The other one is what he calls heavenly Eros, and its main characteristic is that it's directed primarily at the soul of the beloved. Okay, so he's saying if you take this thing that is romantic love or romantic attraction, you can then distinguish between two different ways it can manifest. And the difference is that it takes a different object in each case. Or maybe what he means is that it has a different basis. Okay, it's not entirely clear. I don't expect you to know. I don't know what he means exactly. It's not entirely clear. And maybe ultimately it comes to the same thing. But anyway, he's saying romantic love, romantic desire, or just desire, it might be aimed at the body of a beloved, right? So its object might be a beloved's body, or its basis might be a beloved's body, or else it might be aimed at the beloved's soul. So its object might be the beloved's soul, or its basis might be the beloved's soul, right? So it might be that you are attracted to someone because of their body, in which case that's the basis, or it might be that you're attracted to someone because of their soul, in which case the soul is the basis. He's saying there's a distinction here. He thinks that in common Eros, because you're just attracted to the body, and because all you want is sexual satisfaction, you don't really care about the quality of the soul. This kind of love, this common love or common Eros, just kind of strikes willy-nilly, right? He says common Eros, you're attracted to both men and women, or I should say, to both boys and women, right? Why? Well, because you're not making distinctions between what is a good object of love, what is a bad object of love. All you care about is the beauty of the body and the sexual satisfaction it can give you. In contrast, the heavenly eros, because it's directed primarily at the soul and primarily at the goodness of the soul, will, he thinks, primarily be directed at boys. Okay, so again, the reason for that is he thinks that boys are more beautiful physically, but also have the better soul, right? More intelligent, more noble, more virtuous, that kind of thing. Again, not condoning the sexist attitude or anything, but that is the background here, is that Pausanias is taking it for granted that the person with the better soul, the more noble soul, the more intelligent soul, is the boy. And so if your eros is a heavenly one, one that's directed at the soul, and presumably at a soul that is good, well, you're primarily going to be interested in boys. Um, but what's important, he says, is that look, the first one, common eros, is not accompanied by a will to nourish the soul of the beloved. So why would that produce much virtue? Um, Whereas in a heavenly eros, where the mentor is actually interested in the virtue of the beloved, well, that's going to be beneficial to society. Okay, that's what's going to contribute to the virtue of the beloved. So that's Pausanias's view. He's agreeing with Phaedrus that love is good, or at least that love can be good. And he's agreeing with Phaedrus that the reason, in many cases, that love is good or can be good is that it inspires to virtue. But what he's saying is not all love does that. If your love, if your eros, right, your desire, your attraction, is primarily motivated by the body of the object or the body of the beloved, well, that's not necessarily going to produce virtue. You have no particular interest in your beloved's mind, their soul, right? You have no particular interest in whether they become virtuous or whether they do things that are shameful. You don't really care about that. You just want sexual satisfaction. In contrast, if your love, your eros, your attraction is based on their soul, right, their mind, now that might produce virtue. That can produce virtue, because there you are concerned with their soul. You have an interest in the flourishing of their soul, their mind, their character, okay? Because that's what you're drawn to. So here you've got a distinction in Pausanias. You've got a metaphysical distinction, right? There's two different kinds of love, two different ways that love can manifest, two ways that it can be like. And each one of those has a different value, right? So that there's an ethical thesis. Each one of those has a different value because one of them can produce virtue and the other one doesn't. Or one of them is more likely maybe to produce virtue and the other one not. Okay, so let's move on now to the last of the three speeches that I want to talk about before we get to Aristophanes' speech, which is Eryximachus's. Um, try to say that 5 times fast. Now, Eryximachus, I'll remind you, is the doctor. And he comes off in the dialogue as being very pompous. Okay, he starts off and he goes, "Well, I'm a doctor, and I and I'm able to say something about this, even though it's outside of his realm of expertise." Um, and what he says is largely a bunch of nonsense. Okay, and he starts talking about things that don't seem to be very relevant. But anyway, he says, "Look, I'm going to correct you about what love is." So about the metaphysical question, right? What is love? He says, love isn't just a matter of attraction to human beauty or between human beings. It's a broader phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that encompasses attraction of things to each other and harmony between them. And here he's clearly playing on the meaning of the word eros in ancient Greek, but also, I mean, what he has in mind here is the way that things in nature, gravitate toward each other or happen together, and the way that notes, for example, in music, can resonate with each other and be harmonious, right? Create harmonies. So he's giving these examples of ways in which places where you find attraction and consonance or harmony elsewhere than in human relations. It's like, okay, so what? But there is a point here that's going to be relevant later for Plato, which is that attraction isn't just to human beings. right? So eros in the sense of attraction. So Plato is going to see eros in the sense of attraction to human beings, or eros in the sense of romantic desire, as just one instance of a much larger desire, a desire for what is good or what is beautiful. Okay, so in Plato's mind, you'll see when Socrates is talking, you'll see that he's going to understand romantic attraction as just a subcategory of attraction in general, which is always an attraction to something that's perceived as good or beautiful. So there's a bit of a, even though this is, what Eryximachus says is largely very silly, I've told you that the speeches build on each other, and Socrates is going to kind of take bits and pieces here and there to try and find what the correct combination is. One thing that he's going to say is, well, Eros is broader than just attraction to human beings. Okay, it's the attraction to human beings is part of a broader phenomenon. So that's everything I want to say about the first three speeches. Okay, so Phaedrus's speech, Pausanias' speech, Eryximachus's speech. I think that I've gone over all the main elements that you're going to need in order to make sense of the two speeches that we're going to concentrate on, namely Aristophanes' speech and Socrates' speech. So now what I want to do is just very briefly, very quickly, just introduce Aristophanes' speech. Okay, as I said, we're not going to talk about it in any detail today. We're pretty much out of time anyway. And so all I'll do is tell you about how he introduces his speech, and then next time we'll go into it in detail. So here is Aristophanes. Here is, I think, one of the only two busts that we have of him. And Aristophanes' speech is going to be quite different from the other ones, because what he's going to do is he's going to tell a myth. He's going to tell, basically, he's going to give a poetic account of Eros. So what he says, he starts by saying that the speeches so far, even though they might be very good, whatever, they've actually failed to grasp the power of love, and they've also failed to grasp the good that it brings. Okay, so he's making two claims here. He's saying that you haven't grasped how powerful an experience love is. So there's something about what love is like, right? A metaphysical question that all the speeches so far have just missed completely. So they've given an inadequate account of what love is like. And also, he says, the speeches so far have failed to grasp what makes love so good. Okay, so there's an ethical point that they've also missed. And he says, I'm going to explain how powerful an experience love is, and I'm going to explain the good that it brings, what the most important good is that it brings to human life. And in order to illustrate those things, he decides that he's going to tell a myth. Okay, so he's going to tell a poetic account of Eros, right, of love, and especially of the origin of Eros. It's very important that to recognize that he knows he's telling a myth here. He doesn't think that what he's saying is literally true. This is a mistake I've seen people make. He's just trying to give a poetic account of what love is, okay, to try to illustrate, like he says, the power of love and the good that it brings to human life. Now, as I've pointed out, it's important to keep this in mind. First off, Plato thinks Aristophanes is a bit of an idiot. He doesn't like him very much. And second off, Aristophanes is drunk. Okay, so the speech, although it isn't, or the myth, although it is in some ways quite profound, quite beautiful, it is also very silly. Like there's very silly images in it, and there's very like awkward images in it. I think we're supposed to, although we're supposed to recognize that there's something deep in there, we're supposed to think it's quite funny. Okay, and of course, given that our topic is love is union, you can probably guess that Aristophanes' speech is about love as a kind of union. Okay? And we'll see we'll see how he describes this, but actually, Aristophanes' speech is one of the most important texts in this kind of tradition of viewing love as a kind of union between the lover and the beloved. Okay, so here is a quick recap of the main points I want you to have gotten out of this lecture. First, the symposium features a series of speeches by different characters about the god Eros, right? Eros, the god of love. And because of the way in which gods are understood, by making speeches about the god of love, the characters are making speeches about the phenomenon of Eros, or romantic love. Now, the early speeches, as we've said, include the view that Eros is good because it inspires virtue in the lover and the beloved. But also, the early speeches raise the point that not all kinds of love are equally good. And it draws an important distinction between love that is directed at the body and love that is directed at the soul. Okay, so some kinds of love have the body of the beloved as their object or as their basis, and other kinds of love have the soul of the beloved as their object or as their basis. And what's claimed is that the ones that have the soul as their object or basis are the better kinds of love. And you'll see that the speeches that come later, especially Socrates' speech, is going to try to incorporate all these elements. Okay, so that's all I've got for today. If you haven't already read the first excerpt from the symposium, Aristophanes' speech, please make sure you do so for the next lecture because that's where we're going to be talking about it in detail. And I'll see you next time. Bye.